Hi guys, it's Geekonomics here, and today I just want to bring you a few thoughts on the next part of the OCR specification, which is to do with the whole notion of consumer surplus. Quite an interesting little section of the spec, and can be applied not only across demand, but particularly across your whole study of market structures as well. So there are three statements in the A-level specification which refer specifically to this whole notion of consumer surplus, and here they are. So number one, explain with the aid of a diagram what is meant by consumer surplus. So the directive word here is explain, and we really do mean just a little bit more than scratch the surface understanding from this term explain, the directive word explain. Secondly, explain and calculate how changes in price affect consumer surplus. So again, scratch the surface, but also pointing you probably towards a multiple choice question because of this whole notion of being able to calculate changes in the consumer surplus element. And then finally, and I'd be very surprised if you did get a complete essay on this specific topic, but evaluate, so a discussion question, evaluate the impact of changes in price on consumer surplus. Now you may well, of course, go into this in a lot more detail in your studies of market structures, but to be asked a specific essay question on this very title in isolation, I would think would be very, very unlikely. That's not to say it won't happen, but in my view, that's rather unlikely. Okay, so let's take each of these in turn and analyse them as we have done in the past. So the first thing that you would need to be able to do is to define consumer surplus, otherwise known as consumer welfare. And what do we mean by consumer surplus? Well, you will know that you receive satisfaction from consuming a good or service, and consumer surplus is the satisfaction which you receive over and above the price which you have had to pay in order to consume said good or service. So, for example, on this particular diagram, just your normal demand curve, I'm sure you're well aware that the demand curve slopes downwards from left to right for a number of reasons. Number one is, of course, because as price falls, quantity demanded rises. And a second reason is that as you consume more of a good, your utility or your satisfaction that you receive from consuming it falls. And as I'm sure you well know, that is known as the law of diminishing marginal utility. If that's a new term to you, I'll put a little card up here to my video on diminishing marginal utility. But let's just take this diagram and let's just see what we would mean here by consumer surplus. So I've got two prices indicated, P1 and P2. If the price is P1 and you're consuming Q1 of that good, well, the revenue to the firm is obviously P1 times Q1, but that leaves this little triangle at the top here, which is the difference between what you are actually paying, your willingness to pay, P1, and, your willingness to pay as shown on the demand curve here, and what you're actually paying, P1. And so there's a gap there between the demand curve and the price you're paying. There's a gap between your willingness to pay and the actual price paid. And that is the surplus, that is the additional satisfaction that you're receiving that you're not actually having to pay for. And so that triangle there would be the consumer surplus gained from consuming Q1 of this particular good or service. If the price dropped and it was P2, then of course the surplus area increases because now you're consuming more of the goods, so you're consuming Q2, and there is a lot more surplus because the distance between your willingness to pay, shown by the demand curve, and the price that you're paying, P2, is greater, especially in these early units. So you can see here, there's your willingness to pay, there's price paid, willingness to pay, price paid. And so all of that triangle, so that's this triangle and this section here, that is all consumer surplus. And as I always tell my students, the really easy way to remember this, because oftentimes you'll be asked to identify this on a diagram, is just remember this. It is consumer surplus is the area above price and below demand. And if you remember that, You'll never go wrong. Okay. Explain and calculate how changes in price affect consumer surplus. So I'm not going to go into the calculation part of it at the moment. It's more likely to be a multiple choice question. And if you understand the sort of explanation, you'll be able to do the calculation. And we could do it on this diagram, but we'll just do it here just for clarity, really. So if the price initially here was P1, then obviously I'll just identify this by way of letters. So A, B, and P1. So A, B, P1, that complete triangle would be the consumer surplus. So the consumer welfare is quite significant in that instance. If, however, price increased to P2, so now we're here, and we're consuming Q2, then of course the area of the triangle will diminish and it will decrease, and it now becomes A, P2, C. So it's this much smaller triangle. And so from the consumer's point of view, rising prices, for example, are very detrimental to our consumer surplus and our welfare, because it is narrowing that gap between our willingness to pay and the price that we're actually paying. And so as a consequence, our welfare is falling. Now, of course, you can see that there are two opposing views here. Firms will want to be reducing our welfare because that means that they can charge us a higher price, whereas we will want the price to go in the other direction because that will, of course, be increasing our welfare. So there's this sort of power struggle going on between the prices increasing at the behest of firms and the prices falling at the behest of the consumer. So that then really, ladies and gentlemen, takes us to this last section about evaluating the impact of changes in price on consumer surplus. There is no doubt that increasing price reduces consumer welfare and reducing price will increase it. And that power struggle, which is consistently going on, firms are fully aware that they can lower our welfare, but there's something else that they're aware of, and maybe you've already spotted it. And I'll just illustrate it on this diagram. And this is to do with revenue, and firms are very savvy about this, and they know all about revenue. When the price was P1 here, the firm's total revenue was P1 Q1. When the price increases to P2, then the revenue is P2 Q2. And so what was consumer surplus, so this whole triangle here, if you just highlight that, at the lower price that was all consumer surplus. When the price reduces, and this is the key thing, when the price increases, this part of the consumer surplus disappears, this part of the consumer surplus remains, but let me just shade this in a sort of X hashed section. This section here becomes part of the firm's total revenue. And so the firms, by charging different prices or higher prices, or more specifically being able to charge us exactly what we are willing to pay, they're able to change consumer surplus into total revenue. Now that, of course, takes us into this whole notion of price discrimination. And what is price discrimination? It means that you charge different groups of people different prices according to their willingness to pay. And what shows their willingness to pay? Their demand curve. So if you're getting a train ticket, adult prices, student prices, concessionary prices. Why are firms doing that? Is it because they're generous? No, it is because they realise that they can change the consumer surplus into revenue. And that, of course, links into a whole other aspect of economics to do with price discrimination, which I will come on to in a later video. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's it, and I'm going to leave it there. Bye for now.